So you're in the market for a new iPad, but you're not sure which one to get, or maybe you already got one and you're trying to figure out whether you made the right decision. In this video, we're going to compare Apple's 3 latest iPads, the iPad 9, the iPad mini 6, and the M1 iPad Pro, and hopefully it'll help you decide which one of these tablets is right for you. Let's ramble.
Hold up, place go wild when I pull up. They all on me like it wants.
Hey, what's up guys? It is great to see you all again, and if you're new here, I'm Patrick and this is where I ramble about tech and other stuff. Okay, so I want to start by saying that all 3 iPads are really solid devices. There are no bad tablets in this lineup. But of course, not all iPads are created equal, and there are some clear differences between these devices. The question is, which iPad is right for you? So first we'll have a closer look at each one of these tablets and their differences. We'll talk about the specs, the design, displays, speakers, you name it. Because of course, those are all relevant when making a purchasing decision. But I think it's at least equally important to look at some of the use cases for these tablets and see which one performs best in a given scenario. And hopefully, by the end of this video, you'll have a clear picture of these tablets and their main differences, and maybe it will make your decision a little bit easier. So let's start with the most obvious difference between these 3 tablets, and that is the design. Both the M1 iPad Pro and the iPad mini are rocking the newer, more modern boxy design, whereas the iPad 9 still has that same design as its predecessors, and it hasn't been updated since, well, not ever really. Sure, maybe slightly smaller bezels, but by and large, Apple has just been cramming better technology into the same stale design. It still has relatively thick bezels, and it has the home button, which also serves as a fingerprint scanner for your biometric authentication. But Apple really did cram a lot into the iPad this time, so let's have a closer look at Apple's entry-level tablet. So this year, the iPad got the A13 Bionic chip, which is the same chip that was used in the iPhone 11, and that is a significant update. Unfortunately, the iPad still comes with only 3 GB of RAM, which is probably its biggest drawback. The second biggest drawback, at least in my opinion, is the non-laminated display. All the other iPads have fully laminated displays, which basically means there is no gap between the glass and the actual display. And this is something you will definitely notice with things like handwriting. When you're using an Apple Pencil on one of the laminated displays, it looks and feels like you're drawing directly on the screen, whereas the non-laminated display of the iPad 9 feels like there's a little bit of a disconnect. Speaking of Apple Pencils, all 3 iPads are compatible with an Apple Pencil, but the iPad 9 still uses the first generation Apple Pencil. The other iPads, even the iPad mini 6, are compatible with a superior Apple Pencil 2. And I do think we got lucky there with the iPad mini because Apple decided to put a USB-C port in there, which we'll talk about later. The iPad 9 is the only iPad that still uses the Lightning port, and therefore you will be stuck with a first generation Apple Pencil. It is also the only new iPad that still has a 3.5mm headphone jack, and while I know a lot of you guys will really like this, I personally wouldn't really let that affect my purchasing decision because you can pick up a cheap USB-C dongle for your wired headphones and use them with any of the other iPads as well. And the last downside I would mention is the fact that while it has stereo speakers, it has them only on one side, which does make a difference when gaming or consuming media. So the old school design, the Apple Pencil 1, the Lightning port, the speakers, all of that does make the iPad 9 feel a little bit outdated. But do not underestimate this entry-level iPad because this updated version actually has a lot to offer for a very reasonable price, because despite of all the updates, Apple did not raise the price, which is still $329. And that is a stark contrast to the $2+ you will pay for a spec'd out M1 iPad Pro. And the iPad 9 has some pretty great updates. It has double the base storage at 64 gigs as opposed to 32 on the previous model, and a second option of 256 gigs if you do need that extra storage. Personally, I wouldn't really recommend anyone to get 64 gigs these days, especially if you plan to use your iPad for some years, but that is up for debate. Another fantastic update is the front-facing camera, which is now a 12-megapixel ultra-wide camera with an f2.4 aperture and center stage, which puts it on par with the iPad Pro, and that is a massive jump from the 1.2 megapixel camera on the previous iPad. In case you're new to center stage, it's basically a software-based crop that allows the camera to zoom in on certain areas, making it seem like it follows you around when you move, keeping you centered. The rear camera is a little less impressive at 8 megapixels, but it gets the job done. Another very interesting feature, and this is a feature the more powerful iPad mini doesn't have, is smart connectors, which means you can in fact hook up the iPad to a keyboard case using the smart connectors. The iPad mini cannot do that. Now, of course, you should ask yourself if you'd even want that on the iPad mini since it would be very cramped for a keyboard, but still, it's a nice option to have. And because of this functionality, it makes the iPad 9 a great entry-level hybrid computer for light office work or for kids to do their homework on. And the iPad 9 actually holds up surprisingly well for most games. Of course, it will play the heavier games at a lower resolution and a bit lower frame rates, and it will hog all of the RAM, but at that price, it's not bad at all. The iPad does come as a cell version, but it only offers a 4G connection. So don't buy the iPad 9 hoping you'll get 5G. That's just not gonna happen. Now let's move on to the smallest iPad of the bunch, which is of course the iPad mini 6, but do not be fooled by its size because this thing is a little powerhouse. It is basically a shrunken down version of the iPad 4, and in some ways it's even better than the Air. And this is of course reflected in the price as it starts at $499 for the 64 gigs base model. And like the iPad 9, it can be upgraded to 265 gigs for $150 more. Why there is not a 128 gigabytes model, I will never understand since this will be the sweet spot for many people, but it is what it is. The iPad mini was definitely the big surprise of the September Apple event. Personally, I forgot all about the iPhone 13 and I was obsessed with this little guy and all that it had to offer. And if you've been to this channel before, you already know how much I love this thing, so no surprises there. The Mini 6 has a brand new design, which is the first update since 2012, so that's almost a decade ago, which makes it look and feel much more like the iPad Air and even the Pro models. I am convinced that this design is here to stay for quite a few years, so it's definitely future-proof, and that is something to consider when you're thinking about buying the iPad 9, because I'm pretty confident that Apple will give the next iPad a similar boxy design, so if you care about that kind of stuff, you might want to sit the iPad 9 out. The Mini 6 has a fingerprint scanner as well, but since there is no home button, Apple placed it in the power button. The volume rockers are also on the side, which can feel a bit awkward at times, and I suspect this was necessary because they needed to make room for the magnetic Apple Pencil. But Apple did add a nice little feature that makes the top button the volume up button, no matter the orientation it is in. One of the major upgrades of the iPad mini 6, in my opinion, is the USB-C port. It opens it up to a ton of possibilities and accessories, and also to much faster transfer speeds. And like we said earlier, USB-C means it is now compatible with the Apple Pencil 2, and that is a great little bonus to have. Especially useful if you use the iPad mini as a secondary iPad, since it's so easy to swap the Pencil 2 between iPads. The mini also has stereo speakers on both sides, which is really nice, especially since you'll be using this device in landscape mode when gaming and consuming content. Now, while it might look like there's 4 speakers, there isn't. It's a dual speaker system, not a quad speaker system like on the iPad Pro, but still it sounds amazing. And when you're gaming, it does actually make a difference to hear where the sounds are coming from. Speaking of gaming, this little iPad can handle any game you throw at it, even very hungry games like Genshin Impact, which I think is pretty darn impressive. And the reason why it can do that is the fact that it is packed with amazing hardware, like the super powerful A15 Bionic chip. We'll be running some benchmark tests comparing all 3 of these tablets towards the end of the video, so you will get a good idea of the differences between them. But first, let's cover some more of the specifics of the iPad mini 6 and of course the M1 iPad Pro. So like I said earlier, the mini does not have smart connectors, so you cannot hook up a keyboard case, but it does have built-in magnets. So it does take Apple's smart folio cases, and Apple made some really cool colors, like my favorite electric orange. The cell version of the Mini 6 does support 5G, whereas the iPad 9 doesn't, and it does have that laminated display we talked about, and that to me is very important on this particular tablet because in my opinion, the iPad Mini 6 is the perfect note-taking device. It even looks like a notepad. And I've mentioned this in previous videos. The M1 iPad Pro is of course also an excellent note-taking device, but it's not exactly discreet, and you're not just gonna whip it out in a meeting to take a quick note. I will totally do that with the iPad mini, as it's inconspicuous enough not to form any kind of barrier between me and the person I'm meeting. Now, I can't be speaking about handwritten notes without mentioning today's sponsor, Paperlike, because that is the first thing I will slap on any iPad because it instantly improves my handwriting. For those of you who don't know Paperlike, it's a screen protector, but it's much more than that. If you're like me and you like to use your iPad to take handwritten notes, Paperlike is a must-have. I don't like how slippery the Apple Pencil feels directly on the iPad's glass surface. Paper-like mimics the feeling of writing on actual paper. You get more control of the pencil when writing, sketching, or drawing due to the paper-like resistance and roughness. It makes your handwriting look much prettier. It also drastically reduces glare and fingerprints. But because of the nanodots technology, it doesn't make your screen look grainy. If you use an Apple Pencil, I can highly recommend getting a paper-like. Every order includes a set of 2 paper-like covers and the application accessories. They offer worldwide shipping, so if you want to try it for yourself, there's a link below the video. Right, a couple more things worth mentioning about the iPad mini 6. One is the upgraded camera system. The iPad mini 6 has the same 12 megapixel ultra-wide front-facing camera as the other two with center stage, but it packs a little more power on the back with a 12 megapixel wide camera as opposed to the 8 megapixels on the iPad 9, and it has a flash. We'll go over all the camera features in more detail when we do the side-by-side specs comparison later on in the video, and as much as I love the iPad mini, it does not come without quirks. The battery life on the mini is not great. Peak brightness is only 500 nits, which can be a bit low when you're using the mini in bright daylight, and of course there is the infamous jelly scroll. I won't go into too much detail there. I dedicated an entire video on this issue, which I will link at the end of this video. For now, I'll just say that yes, it is noticeable, but it strongly depends on the user whether it bothers you or not. Personally, I really don't care. It doesn't bother me at all, but I know some people find it very irritating to the point where they have returned their devices, so it's definitely something to keep in mind. Now let's move on to the absolute powerhouse, the behemoth, the mother of all iPads, the M1 iPad Pro. Apple definitely has this marketed at the Pro users, and much more than the other two, this one is intended to replace your computer in many ways. Remember, your next computer is not a computer. Before we put these iPads side by side in terms of specs, let's go over a few of the unique features of the M1 iPad Pro. The most obvious one being, well, the M1 chip. This iPad actually has the same chip as the M1 Mac lineup, and to me, that's kind of mind-blowing. When Apple launched this iPad during the Apple Spring event, they presented this as some devilish, genius move, and us tech heads were all really excited. Not only did it come with an M1 chip, the 2021 iPad Pro also comes in a 16GB version. That's right, 16 gigs of RAM on a tablet. That is insane. But the way Apple went about this is a little annoying, because the only way you can get the 16 gig version is by upgrading the internal storage to at least 1 terabyte. You cannot get 16 gigs on the 512 gigs model, which for me would have been more than enough. I'm not sure why Apple chose to do this. Most likely it's financially motivated, but whatever. The iPad Pro also comes with the ridiculously crisp Liquid Retina XDR mini LED display that has a peak brightness of 1600 nits in HDR mode, and it's basically a small version of Apple's extremely expensive Pro Display XDR. The Pro has a quad-core speaker system, 2 on each side in landscape mode, providing an amazing audio experience, studio quality microphones, and it is the only iPad that has a Thunderbolt port. It is also the only tablet in this lineup that has a LiDAR scanner. Currently, it's mostly used for camera improvements and a bit of AR, but I do think it has massive potential for future applications. The iPad Pro doesn't have a fingerprint scanner, it has Face ID only, but that does work very well. Alright, so let's do a side-by-side comparison of the specs and cameras on these machines before I will give you some final thoughts on each one of those tablets and who I think these iPads are really for. The iPad 9 has an A13 Bionic chip, up to 256 gigs of storage, 3 GB of RAM, 6-core CPU, 6-core GPU, and an 8-core neural engine. The iPad mini is significantly more powerful, carrying an A15 Bionic chip, up to 256 gigs of storage, 4 GB of RAM, 6-core CPU, 6-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. And of course, the M1 iPad Pro takes the cake with the M1 chip, up to 2 TB of storage, up to 16 GB of RAM, 8-core CPU, 8-core GPU, and a 16-core neural engine. Of course, you will also find some clear differences in graphics performance, which becomes visible when we run a wildlife stress test. Aside from the benchmarks, which you can see here on the screen, you can actually see the iPad 9 visibly struggling a bit and dropping some frames. As for the cameras, all 3 iPads have the 12 megapixel ultra-wide front-facing camera. On the back side, the iPad 9 has an 8 megapixel wide camera, the Mini 6 has a 12 megapixel wide camera and a flash, and the M1 has 2 cameras, 12 megapixel wide, 10 megapixel ultra-wide, flash, and of course the LiDAR scanner. So looking at all this, the M1 iPad Pro is clearly the best tablet, right? Well, it's not that straightforward. Sure, on paper, the other two pale in comparison, but in reality, much of the excessive power of the M1 iPad Pro isn't really utilized, and some of the things we hope to see did not materialize. There is still no real external monitor support. We are still stuck with those hideous black bars. The Thunderbolt port is awesome, but it appears to be throttled, so we cannot really enjoy the full Thunderbolt speeds. There are still no real pro apps like Final Cut Pro and Logic available on the iPad Pro, and developers are not able to utilize the full 16 gigs for their apps. In my personal opinion, the spec'd out M1 iPad Pro has been complete overkill. It's almost like Apple wanted to show us all the things they were able to cram into a tablet without actually developing the software to use all of that power. So with that in mind, it is difficult to justify the maxed out M1 iPad Pro right now. If you do want to get a Pro, get the base model or even consider an iPad Air. Of course, if you have the cash to burn and you really like the XDR display and you just want the best of the best, the M1 iPad Pro is the way to go. Now, the other two are a little more difficult to place. The 9 is a strange one. Normally, I'm not interested in the entry-level iPads, but Apple managed to turn the base model iPad into a very capable device. I think the iPad 9 is perfect for people who are just switching from Android tablets and want to dip their toes in iOS water. It's great for students who need a hybrid computer that doesn't break the bank, and it's the perfect iPad for kids. In our house, my 6-year-old daughter uses it every day and she loves it. Slap on a thick bumper case and your kids will enjoy this tablet for years. And then there is the Mini. The Mini. This is the tablet none of us really need, but most of us really want. It's definitely the funnest of the bunch. It's small, it's light, it's powerful, perfect for handheld gaming, note-taking and consuming content on the couch. However, there are times that you might find yourself wanting for a bigger screen. I would probably describe the iPad Mini as the perfect second tablet. The Mini is an ideal companion if you already have another iPad. Now, what I would personally be extremely interested in is an iPad Mini Pro. Let me know in the comments if you agree. Guys, if you enjoyed the video, please give it one of these. It really does help the channel. Subscribe for more content. Thank you so much for watching and see you in the next one.